And good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin our formal webinar, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and to appreciate something that very few of us that were living at the time will ever forget. It was 22 years ago on this very date, September 11th, 2001, when terrorists attacked our country, most notably the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. Many of us thought that type of attack could never happen. It would never happen, but it did. And so at this time, I guess I would ask all of us in a moment of silence to, in our own way, to acknowledge and to show appreciation for not only those who served, but certainly for those who lost their lives and whose families suffered because of it. So if you would, for a few moments, we'd all appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to the Maine State Chamber's webinar entitled Understanding Pine Tree Power. Actually, it is really trying to separate fact from fiction. My name is Dana Connors. I'm pleased to be the moderator for this program, this very timely program, as we take an in-depth look at the ballot question number 3 that you will be asked to vote on November the 7th of this year. And with the help of 2 outstanding, very distinguished and experienced panelists, and with your questions, we'll unpack the issues, the impacts, and the problems facing our state, our economy, and our taxpayers if Pine Tree Power were to pass. But first, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Linda Caprera. Linda is the interim president and CEO of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, and she has an important message to share with all of us. Linda?
Thank you, Dana. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say up front that the Maine State Chamber of Commerce strongly opposes question 3. The threat that question 3 poses to Maine business is real. Back in 2020, under the leadership of Dana, the Chamber made the decision to join the Maine Affordable Energy Coalition, and we're happy to partner with the coalition again to defeat this measure. With that, I'd like to thank our sponsors, our presenting sponsor, which is the Maine Affordable Energy Coalition, our webinar series sponsors, which is Central Maine Power, Delta Dental, Eaton Peabody, Kennebec Savings Bank, and First Light. And I just have a couple of administrative things to go over with you. This is being recorded, this webinar. You are presently on mute, and use the same URL if you're disconnected. And if you have any questions, raise your chat function. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dana. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks for the message and for the support of the State Chamber of Commerce. I want to briefly introduce both of our panelists. As I mentioned a moment ago, if you've been around the State House, you'll recognize both of them. As a matter of fact, their experience and their reach of service goes well beyond the community to an entire state. We're very proud that they're with us to help us answer some of the questions, both that we have, but also that you in the audience may have as well. The first is Jim Cohen. Jim Cohen is with Vero Partners, and he has had a very long and distinguished experience and expertise, if you will, in the field of energy. There are few, if any, that has had the type of broad experience and has gained the knowledge over time by the way that energy has evolved over time, and he's been front and center in that regard. Our other panelist, I'm pleased to say, is Charlotte Warren, and Charlotte's mantra is public service. She has been a mayor of Hollowell, a legislator representing that region, a social worker, educator, but most of all, she is one who stands up for social justice above and beyond all else. So I welcome them to add anything they'd like to, but those are the people that I'm proud to say, those 2 that will be our panelists. And I'm going to ask each of them a question in just a moment to get us started while the questions come before us. But as Linda, to pick up on what Linda has just mentioned a moment ago, I'm going to ask another important person for us, and that is Peter Close. Peter is with SALT Public Affairs. He's also a member of the the Maine Affordable Energy Coalition, and he is our technology expert, and he will tell you how best to access so that your question can be asked. Peter?
Thank you so much, Dana. I'll leave from behind the curtain just now. So we're obviously going to open it up to questions and answers in just a few moments once Jim and Shar get us started. But if you'd like to ask a question, I've also put instructions in the chat. So please just raise your hand and we'll try to get to you and bring you live. Or if you'd like to have Dana ask your question, please enter your question via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Once we get to your question and your hand is raised, I'll request to bring you up as a panelist. There will be a brief pause while it loads you back into the call. And then once you are brought live, be sure to turn on your camera and your microphone, and we'll get straight to your question. And please, if you could, keep your questions as brief and succinct as possible so that we can get to as many people as we can. It'll be a quick hour and 50 minutes. So we'll try to do as much as we can in that time. So with that, you'll see the instructions in the chat, but take it away.
Thanks, Peter. And again, to our two panelists, I'm going to begin with the question itself. I'm going to ask Charlotte, if we do have the slide to present it, have Charlotte speak to us about what is in that question. What does it say and what concerns her from the part of her responsibilities to her people? Charlotte?
Great. Thank you, Dana. And again, thank you for having us here to discuss this important issue. So here's the question, and I'm going to read it out loud. Do you want to create a new power company governed by an elected board to acquire and operate existing for-profit electricity transmission and distribution facilities in Maine? So there's the question that we'll all see on our November 7th ballot. And here's what concerns me. The proponents of question 3 are asking Mainers to take a really large gamble. While that is a one statement, there is, as we all know, an entire document, right, that backs up that question. But there's a lot that's missing, right? There's a lot that folks don't know just from that question. So let me try to cut through what it means and just say what it's asking us to do. The proponents are asking Mainers to do something we've never done before. They want the state to take over 2 utilities, 2 private companies, take over, seize by eminent domain, 2 businesses, 2 companies that are not for sale at a cost in the billions of dollars. We all know here, when you incur that kind of debt, you must pay back that kind of debt. In this document, again, there is nothing about how it will improve service. There is nothing about how it will reduce rates. But here's one thing that it is very clear, 2 things that are very clear. This new company will be run by an elected board. Now, as you said, Dana, at the very opening, I've been in public service for a long time, 21 years to be exact. I know a lot about how politics works. And the idea of having politicians run our grid scares me. It is very risky. And as our public advocate said last week, the idea of investments and rates, lower rates, they're in conflict with each other. So you're constantly having to balance that. We see it all the time when we look at our roads in the state of Maine, right? What are we going to pay versus how we're going to take care of those roads? So I'm very concerned about the debt, and I'm very concerned about the lack of a plan. Here's the final piece. This legislation, again, is very clear that at the end of the day, a private contractor will be hired to run the grid. We will be at exactly the same place we are at now. When we hear all of the rhetoric about shareholders and profit, I don't understand how the other side can say that that will not exist when this very document says we will hire a private for-profit company to run the grid. So there's the question, and those are my concerns to get us started.
Well, we appreciate that, Charlotte. It sounds like there's no question, but what the risk, the uncertainty, and the cost are prevailing concerns. So, Jim, with all of your knowledge and experience and background in energy, let's assume for a moment that it does pass. There's a whole array of responsibilities that take time. Can you share some of that? What would that mean? How would that translate? You're on mute, Jim.
That start off with a little technical difficulty, which actually ties in well with the slide before you, which is that electric systems are very complex, and it's up to the men and women who work in this field to make sure that the software is running properly, that the billing and metering is occurring properly, that outages are repaired. Anything that puts the system in imbalance can cause blackouts and the power to go out. And for a system that we all rely on, it just puts incredible importance on doing it right. And when we talk about change, we need to be very careful about what that change can be. And we need to be convinced, if we're going to change our system, that that system will work, because literally lives depend on it. So let's talk for a minute about our high-level concerns. And Char touched on a number of these, and I'm going to go into these a little bit more in detail. But at very high level, we're concerned about a decade of legal process and litigation. We're concerned about the taxable debt to take over CMP and Versant, which in our calculations is $13.5 billion. We're concerned about that for-profit grid operator Charlotte talked about, and that grid operator would earn $82 million a year in profits, which is in addition to what we pay today. That 100% of the financial risk of running the utility now falls on Maine consumers, that it creates an untenable regulatory structure, and we'll talk about that, and it's unprecedented. This has never happened before. And it's important to know, Pine Tree Power looks like only two other utilities in America, Long Island Power Authority and the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, both of whom have had significant problems. Puerto Rico is in bankruptcy. They measure outages in terms of months, not days or hours. And to touch on the points that Charlotte mentioned earlier, and our public advocate said something similar last week, is that there's nothing in question 3 that ensures that the quality of our electric service will improve unless we pay more, which is exactly what a consultant for the Public Utilities Commission said 3 years ago. There's nothing that ensures our rates go down. There's nothing to ensure that it will improve the environment, and it will not get rid of for-profit companies or stop the flow of our money out of state, nor will it look anything like the small municipal utilities we have here in Maine. As I said, there's only two other utilities in America that look like Pine Tree Power. None of them are in Maine or New England. So those are some of the high-level concerns that we have, Dana.
Well, thanks, Jim. And you certainly make a persuasive statement when you outline all of those various things that we need to be concerned about. There is a question here. It goes back to the cost element, and it raises the issue that you spoke of, but expands a bit on it. And that is, it's estimated to be $13.5 billion. And the question is, have there been another number that's been set forward by the Pine Tree Power people? That was one part of the question. The other part was, when you raised the point about you're going to have to hire, both you and Charlotte spoke to it, hiring a private operator at 82 million, that's already, that part is already paid for today by the current system. But there's also the cost of continuing to invest to be sure that our renewables, which is so important that the climate change challenge is met. When you add those costs up, that's a significant burden that it's hard to imagine how one can justify it. But speak to it, either one of you or both of you, in terms of, is that point, am I missing something when I say that? Because it sounds to me to be pretty clear that its accumulated cost is significant as 13.5 billion is. You've got those other aspects that just add to the burden.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. And those are significant issues. And to really understand why we talk about those acquisition costs and how high they would be and how they would affect our rates, and also to look at, will this take steps to improve our environment? What will those costs be? It's important to back up a step, to understand what it is that we're actually voting on, because I think it leads to the answer to the questions that you asked, Dana. So the first thing is the system we have now. As Charlotte mentioned, question 3 says we're going to take over CMP and Versant Power. But the structure we have today is that we have an appointed Public Utilities Commission. Those 3 appointed members regulate CMP and Versant. The rates that they charge are set by them. It takes as much as a year of litigation before a rate can be changed. Decisions like tree trimming, decisions like investing in new facilities ultimately are governed by our regulator. The utilities will advocate for activities, but ultimately those decisions are made by a regulator, because we have a regulated monopoly. That's what we've had for over 100 years. Pine Tree Power, question 3, would change that. Yes, it would keep the Public Utilities Commission, those appointed officials, and it would create a new quasi-governmental authority called Pine Tree Power. We call it a quasi-governmental authority. That's what the law court called it in the spring. And that would be governed by a board of 13. Each member would serve for 6-year terms. And so every 2 years, the composition of the board could change by about a third. 7 of them are elected, each serving about 150,000 people. And they in turn would appoint 6 more members who collectively have to have certain qualifications, but individually do not. And there's not a confirmation process either. So those 13 members who we don't know will be in charge of the Pine Tree Power Authority. That's important because, Dana, when you talk about the environment and investments, a lot of it is up to what is proposed by those 13 people. We don't know whether they'll be more conservative leaning, whether they'll be more progressive leaning, and they could change every 2 years, that philosophy based on electoral cycles. They will in turn hire staff. That is a new bureaucracy with directors and assistant directors, lawyers, consultants, and we'll be paying for all of that in our rates. That's required under question 3. And they in turn will hire that private for-profit operating company that Charlotte talked about. And that structure, again, only 2 utilities in America have that structure. And we also have to think about how it works. What's the interaction among those different parties? You have an appointed Public Utilities Commission and an elected board. And how does that work? When we talk about risk, right now, the model we have, CMP and Versant, their shareholders take a lot of risk. But when we have a government authority, ultimately that risk falls on us. And so if there are expenses different than what we expect, that risk falls on us. And we can talk about that a little bit more. The other thing,
you go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the other thing is how we get to the $13.5 billion. Yes. It starts with understanding the process by which question 3 operates. And Last week, the public advocate said that it would be about a 5 to 10 year process. Really, the difference between 5 and 10 is whether there will be litigation and what that litigation looks like. Now, we believe there will be litigation. Why? Because when we're talking about multiple billions of dollars for companies that are not for sale, there is simply no way that the government agency, the Pine Tree Power Board, is going to offer the amount that the two companies believe their companies are worth. And I have experience from the 1990s representing two small water companies that were taken over by eminent domain. And when they were, there was litigation, not around the legality, just around the valuation of those two small utilities, 3.5 years of litigation. Now, multiply that by billions of dollars statewide and two different companies, and the fact that litigation has gotten longer, not slower in 25 years, 5 years is reasonable. So when we talk about what kinds of investments get made, we have climate issues occurring right now, and the governor's climate action plan comes and goes in 2030. We're spending our time fighting about who owns the grid and how much we're going to pay, rather than focused on how we're going to operate the grid today. The other thing, when we talk about costs and risks, we vote in November 2023 without knowing how much CMP and Versant will cost us. So we write a blank check and we fill in the amount that we pay when our law court finally decides how much CMP and Versant are worth in about 7 or 8 years. That'll be the first time we know how much we've signed up for. And I don't know about you, but I usually don't walk into car dealerships and buy a car that I don't know and say, charge me whatever you want and let me know in a few years. I kind of like to know what I'm buying up front. So when we talk about why 13.5 billion, a lot of the factor is time. Because the Public Utilities Commission did a study a few years ago. They said if the takeover occurred in 2024, then it would be $8.2 billion. But we know that that's not going to happen because we're not even passing this legislation until November of 2023. So we're well beyond that. So time plus the uncertainty of how to value the utility. The takeovers, the few takeovers that have occurred have all been at a higher net book value multiplier. And when you use a reasonable multiplier times time, you get to $13.5 billion. Though these are the risks that we're very concerned about.
Yeah, there's a number of questions in the chat room now. I'm going to pick one of the earliest ones, and it kind of follows up on what was said. With all of the risk and unknown, how is it that Pine Tree Power and the information that they share with the public says that they can reduce rates? What would be your answer to that?
I think it's a great question, Dana. And I think it's something we've been asking, and I've seen the people of Maine asking, right? In whenever there are things posted in the newspaper or on Facebook or, any kind of social media, if you go and look at what those either social media users are asking or commenters in the newspaper, they are asking for this information. Right? They want to know. I mean, we've been asked so many times, right? What's our number? What do we say it's going to cost? Well, I think the people who are putting this forward, they should be telling us, right? What is this going to cost? And they also should be showing us, how is this going to cost? How's it going to cost? How is it going to reduce the price that my mother in West Gardner is going to pay? Right? Who's already making, tough financial decisions, right? What's the plan? And it's, there's a lot of aspiration, and I appreciate that. I am, a hope monger among the best of them, but optimism is not a plan, right? And that's a part of what informs my opposition to this proposal. Is that before you do something of this consequence, you should be able to make sure that, to use an old sort of cliche, all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. And we just aren't able to get this information. There is not, and again, I keep holding this up, right? This is the document that's behind that question. There is nothing in there that will show us why it will bring rates down. What we do know, our number, 13.5 billion, I found one place where our power was quoted. They say 9 billion, right? I gave Peter the link if he wants to share that article. It's from December. It's when our power submitted their signatures. They were quoted as saying it would cost 9 billion. So in either case, we're talking about debt of billions of dollars that Mainers will be on the hook for, and that's not a recipe for lowering rates.
Yeah,
Well said.
if I could just supplement that, there's a slide in front of us that looks at before and after. So again, you assume that a takeover occurs in 2030, and why is anyone talking about this change? Will it save us money? There is a piece that is accurate when proponents say there is an opportunity to save money, and that's because if the government owns the assets on a going forward basis, the government can borrow money for less than companies in the private sector. So that's the promise of Pine Tree Power, that going forward, you can have investments that are less, except you're not starting from scratch. You're starting in the hole by $13.5 billion. And that is not at government borrowing rates. Those are at market rates, and those are fully taxable under federal tax law. So yes, and you can see from this chart that the capital costs would go down under Pine Tree Power. But then you need to add back in $13.5 billion worth of debt. And that overwhelms the savings that you have in capital costs. Then you have a new fee that we don't currently have today in rates. And that is paying that private grid operator. So today, if you look at that light gray box, T&D operating costs, those are the salaries and the fuel, oil, the sort of operating costs that the utility has, whether the utility is run, or whether the utility is owned by the government or whether the utility is owned by a private entity. It is simply a pass-through of costs, no markup. Shareholders do not earn any more money on operating costs. So it doesn't matter who owns the utility. But when CMP pays for all those employees, they don't have a markup. But when a private grid operator comes along, like they have in Long Island, they earn an additional management fee. And that's that $82 million a year number that I mentioned earlier. That's a new cost. Another new cost, we've got a new bureaucracy, and it's paid for in our rates. So before, the average residential customer would be paying $158. After, it would be $172 a month, plus whatever the cost of the new bureaucracy. Now, these are estimates. We don't know for sure, but it's not just what appears on your bill, because the government buys electricity, so it shows up in your taxes. The grocery store has to cool the food, and they pay for electricity, so your grocery costs go up. Everything in our society that involves electricity, those costs go up.
Let me ask a question that was put forward in our chat that said, you'd spoken earlier about the local experience, and I think most notably you talked about the only two that existed was Long Island Power Authority and also Puerto Rico, and they had serious issues. Isn't the question that's been posed is that isn't there in Nebraska a situation where it's stated that local government controls it and has lower rates and fewer outages. Can't we do that here? What's the story behind that statement?
I think it's
Yeah.
really interesting because, thank you, Dana, for the question. I think it's really interesting because the proponents keep talking about this proposal and describing it in a way that, again, this document does not talk about it. We are, again, talking about a very clear proposal that states politicians, elected officials will run it, but they will hire a for-profit company. So this idea that this is exactly the same as these cooperatives and small municipalities and Nebraska and all of these comparisons, we have to remember that we are not talking about all of those. We're talking about this right here, right?
Mhm.
And this right here says that what it looks like is we're going to end up in exactly the same place we are right now with investor-owned utilities, but plus billions of dollars in debt and politicians running the grid. So I just want to be clear that when the proponents are trying to describe it as something else, it isn't. And it's very clear in this plan.
And just to pick up on what Shar said, Nebraska is not a single public utility, publicly owned utility. It is a bunch of small municipal and regional utilities. Some are rural electric cooperatives, some are municipal government utilities. None of them have private grid operators like Pine Tree Power. They also are in very different states with different, many different features to them, which I'll touch on. For example, trees. Maine is the most forested state in the nation, and about 87% of all outages are caused by trees. 82% of those outages are caused by trees outside of the right-of-way. So whether or not it's CMP or Versant or Pine Tree Power who owns the grid, those trees will still be outside the right-of-way. They will still fall on our lines, and they will still cause our power to go out. But if you look at Nebraska and the public officials, they're spent every year in some of these utilities when people are running for office, the amount that gets spent on their elections starts to go up because of the money involved. And they have to make choices about how they're going to invest their money. And sometimes they choose to underinvest. And so if you look at Nebraska, they're near the bottom in energy efficiency, whereas we're in the top third. In terms of grid modernization, Nebraska is near the bottom and Maine is in the middle. And then if you look at our energy mix, the proponents talk about how Pine Tree Power will be greener, but Maine is already one of the greenest states in the country from our fuel mix. Yet Nebraska is mostly coal and nuclear. And a lot of it is because of cost. They don't want to make the investments in green power that Maine has made and continues to underwrite. And it's worth noting, there's been a lot of conversation about net energy billing over the last year or so. CMP and Versant are required to support net energy billing, but the consumer-owned utilities that we have in Maine are not. And they didn't want to be covered by it. And nationally, the agency, the state, the trade association that represents rural electric cooperatives, they are opposing the EPA's clean energy plan. And a lot of it is driven by cost. And cost is important, but so is investment.
This question kind of builds, well, it doesn't really build upon it, but it was touched upon a bit previously, but this one is kind of a clarifying question, and it comes like this. You're going to have to fill in the what the initials mean, but the question is, will IOUs being better for climate goals, meeting climate goals versus COUs? which is a question for both of you.
Yeah, and maybe I'll start, but I think the question kind of follows nicely on the point I was making earlier, which is that when you have elected boards, those individuals have to go to the voters and advocate for policies. And rates are obviously an important piece. And so you can imagine when somebody is running for office, their term is about to expire and they have to run for office again. One of the things they'll be judged on is, did you spend more money? And with an electric grid, you do need to spend money. You do need to make sure that the lights stay on. And when states have goals to expand green energy, that does require some investment. And the larger states like Nebraska and the rural electric cooperative trade associations, they aren't supportive of more green energy investments. The bottom line is we don't know who will be elected. We could elect a very conservative board and they will say, we don't want to make any investments. We would rather keep rates low. We could elect a very progressive board who would have the opposite view. And none of us have crystal balls to know who those people will be, what their motivations will be, and what they will favor.
Yeah, and there's another question that's been brought forward based upon that comment, but others that have referenced the elected officials, in which the question really is posed in this way. Isn't that really a major problem associated with Pine Tree Power, in that you're putting your decisions in the hands of elected people, not necessarily with skill or experience, more about popularity? And they ask for either of you to respond to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think let's just get right to it. When you're running for election, you want to win votes. And you don't win votes by raising people's costs, right? People hate it when we do that, right? So these things are going to be in constant competition, number one. Number two, we already have a lot of money in politics in Maine. I think everyone would agree. People are already sick of, the commercials, right? Well, get ready, because if this were to pass, we are now bringing in a whole different level of money in our state, because it isn't just about what do people in Maine want. This will become a national response, right? We all know that. People on both sides of the issue will be trying to weigh in through their dollars to elected officials. You may disagree, people might not like the system, but that is the system. The system that we have right now is that politicians raise money from donors, and donors then expect from some politicians results that they want. It may not be a fun thing to hear about, but it's the truth. And that's why this is dangerous. We have seen, and Jim can give you this example, where we have seen when there's an elected board, debt not going away, but debt getting larger because of this tension I'm talking about.
Yeah, let me pick up on that, because 2 years ago, when this proposal was in front of the legislature, there was a group of former PUC commissioners, and those are the folks who regulate our utilities today. That group was very concerned about Pine Tree Power, because today, when the Public Utilities Commission regulates investor-owned utilities, and this was a question about IOUs, which are investor-owned utilities, like CMP and Versant, there are shareholders. And if either of those utilities behaves in a way that's considered improper by the PUC, they can fine the utilities. They can reduce the returns. And that has happened. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen, and it can happen, and that's an important regulatory tool. Now remove shareholders. If the elected officials, the board that is a quasi-governmental authority where the backstop is we, the ratepayer, who do you fine? Who do you penalize if there's bad behavior? How does an appointed 3-member board of PUC commissioners effectively regulate 7 elected board members who have 150,000 constituents? There's a power imbalance that exists there, which makes it even more difficult to regulate those companies. And let's look at who they are. The 7 members, the only thing in law for their qualifications, they have to be 21 years of age or older, and they have to reside in their district. That's it. Beyond that, there's no further qualification. And you can look at other the 2 other utilities with this model, one of which is Long Island Power. In Superstorm Sandy, there was a tremendous failure to restore power. And so a commission was formed called the Moreland Commission. And what they found was that that this elected board and the private for-profit company that managed the grid was a revolving door of lawyers and lobbyists going back and forth between the two, that there was a disregard for consumers. And right now, New York State is actually trying to get rid of their current grid operator, and they can't even find one to replace the one that they have. So the reality is investor-owned utilities do provide a backstop to reduce risk on our consumers. And the last example I'll give is one ripped from the headlines. But just this past week, our public advocate said, when Central Maine Power last year during the Christmas storm was deciding and investing $53 million to restore power, and they did so in 4 days rather than the 8 days that was in our standard, I think most of us thought that was a good thing, because we don't want to be sitting without power for 4 extra days. But our public advocate said that office didn't believe that Central Maine Power should recover that money because they should have restored power more slowly than that. And that is a political decision based upon weighing rates more heavily than people's service quality. And those are the kinds of decisions that can be made when politicians or elected officials are making decisions. They might make different ones. And if CMP isn't able to recover that money, that's on the shareholder. Imagine if this was Pine Tree Power. There's no way that the public advocate could say it couldn't be recovered. We would be paying for any kind of imprudent cost. It would be on our dime, our nickel.
Consumer-owned utility, the COU. The question is Pine Tree Power consumer-owned?
So short answer, and I'll put my lawyer hat on for a minute. There is a definition in Maine law of a consumer-owned utility, and there are 5 kinds of consumer-owned utilities. They include municipal, quasi-municipal utilities like Kennebunk Light and Power, or if this were in the water district world, Portland Water District or Kennebec Water District. Those are one kind of consumer-owned, and the other kind would be a rural electric cooperative. But there are 5 of them. There is no consumer-owned electric utility that includes a model like Pine Tree Power, where you have a quasi-municipal, quasi-governmental authority that owns the grid, and then you have a private company for a manager. Now, question 3 tries to address that by creating a new definition of consumer-owned, but that's not currently in the law. And just this past April, when the ballot question for Pine Tree Power was being decided, our Secretary of State included the word quasi-municipal. And so this was the ballot question. What it used to say was, do you want to create a new quasi-governmental power company? And the proponents of the ballot question, Our Power, sued the Secretary of State saying, don't include that word, and please include the word consumer-owned. The law court ultimately decided, yeah, it's a quasi-governmental authority, but most people don't know what quasi-governmental means, so don't put it in the ballot question because it's confusing to people. But they also said it's not currently a consumer-owned utility, and it looks a whole lot like a government utility.
Yeah. We've only got a few minutes left, and I got about 3 questions. One of them, I'll take the responsibility for asking, but in our responsibilities as the state chamber, we recognize that Maine is really a small business state. 80% of our businesses employ fewer than 20 people. Is there a possibility that there could be a discrepancy, that's a bad choice of words, that wouldn't be an even application, that some communities could be left in the dust just because of their size, their rural nature, whatever? In other words, that we want everybody to be treated equal regardless of size. Is there reason to be concerned about that?
I think a great example is when we think about earmarks in Congress, or when we think about those of us in the legislature who are fighting for our particular portion of the state. Yes, we are, right? That's what you do when you're an elected official. So yes, these particular folks that are elected to the board, they're absolutely going to be making sure that their communities get the best. That's part of why we ask people to represent us. And it's also part of the reason why I have real concerns about introducing electoral politics to something as important as our electric grid. We all know how it works, right? We can say lots of different things. We can have great dreams. But we all know how politics works. And we know that folks are always fighting for a better advantage for those regions. And these are going to be very large regions. It's another reason that all of us should be concerned.
Yeah. Well, right. Charlotte, I'm going to keep you on because there's a question in the queue here that acknowledges that it's not accusatory. It simply says we're aware that you changed your position over time. At one time, you supported the government owned, but obviously, in hearing you and understanding your responses, you are certainly an advocate for what we presently have. Can you speak to how that might have changed, how that change might have come about?
Absolutely. And thank you for the question. So yes, this was in the legislature. It was LD 1708. And when it came to my desk to vote on, the vote we took was, did we want to send this to the voters? Yes, I have always voted to send, when there's a question of should the people of Maine, should the constituents that I represent, should they get a chance to vote on this? You can count on the fact that I'm going to say yes, because that's what I believe in. But let me hit the second part. Yes, when I heard this proposal, I was in. And here's why I was in. I want the people that I represented, it's no longer current, I'm now retired from being an elected official, but I wanted the people that I represented to have what all of the promises that were being made. Right? I wanted my constituents to get lower rates. I wanted my constituents to have shorter times of when they'd be without power, right? And let me tell you something about my childhood. I grew up here in Maine. I actually live about 15 minutes from where I grew up on the banks of the Kennebec, and I still live on the banks of the Kennebec now in Hollowell. I grew up in Pittston. You know, when I was a kid, once a year or twice a year, my dad would come home with bags of Maine shrimp, right? And he'd boil it up, and we'd cover the table with newspaper, and he'd just dump the shrimp, and we'd peel and eat. And it was a really big part of my childhood. We don't have that anymore, right? I used to go to the smelt shacks right down on the Kennebec every year, and we'd smelt, and it was a big part of my childhood. And the smelts aren't there, and the ice isn't solid, and you guys all don't need me to tell you that I have real fears about what climate change means for Maine. So yes, when these promises were made, lower rates, better service, better chance of renewable energy and doing something that's going to make our chances to fight climate change here in Maine better, I said yes. And then you just simply read the proposal and those things aren't in there. And here's the thing I know that when you pass a law, you better make sure that what you want to do is actually written in the law, because the law will pass and then that's what you're left with. And what I know from reading this document is that those promises are just promises. There is not a plan. And that is why I will be voting against this. And that is why I am an opponent of this, because here's the thing I know. There's a lot of things in Maine that the government needs to do better at. We have a lot on our plate. And to put this on there when there isn't even a plan, it does not make sense to me. It's not practical. That is why I voted yes to send it to the voters. And it's why I am doing the work I am right now, because I care about this state, and this is bad medicine for Maine. And I thank you for the question.
Well, I thank you for the answer. Peter, I see one other question that I had not posed to the panel. I'm going to do it right now. And if there's others that I've overlooked, please bring to my attention. But the question is, they acknowledge that the Maine State Chamber opposes question 3. But they also ask, who else is opposing question 3?
Yeah, so Maine Affordable Energy is a coalition. And that coalition is made up of large and small businesses, trade associations like the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, representing all different types of business groups. It includes the trade associations that include our consumer-owned water and sewer districts, which on the one hand might seem curious because those small municipal, quasi-municipal water and sewer districts are kind of like Pine Tree Power. They don't have private operators in most cases, although some do. They feel, yeah, on the local level, this works. But on the state level, they don't have any faith or confidence that it can work. And so they opposed Pine Tree Power. There are 11,000 citizens who have signed up, and that number is growing. And then labor unions. The workers themselves for CMP and Versant are very opposed. They are very concerned about that private grid operator. They don't know who it will be. And even though the bill gives them some protections for 2 years, whenever that is, it ends after 2 years. It gives no protections for any other employees of those two companies. There could be a revolving door of private grid operators, and that has the workers concerned. They're also concerned that there could be no private grid operator at all, which is what the Public Utilities Commission 2020 study cautioned us, that there's a very small number of private grid operators out there. So that's the AFL-CIO, IBEW, Teamsters, the BIW unions are all opposed. Governor Mills and Governor LePage may not agree on many things. They both agree that Pine Tree Power is a bad idea. There are a number of mayors that came out against it. More recently, 81 former legislators from both sides of the aisle came out against it. So it is a large group of people, and growing, who understand there are a lot of concerns that we should be having about Pine Tree Power.
And that support that Jim has spoken of is extremely important. But what is also important is that you get out the vote. On November the 7th, we will be asked to approve or reject 4 citizens-initiated ballots. And as you've heard here today, the state chamber believes that Question 3, Pine Tree Power is an extreme experiment that we cannot afford to take a chance on. That's our opinion, and that is the opinion of that group that Jim outlined. But before we leave, we want once again to thank our sponsors that you see on the slide before you, to thank Maine Affordable Energy to teaming up with the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, and above all else, as Charlotte shared with you at the outset, look at the language, seek out the facts. Facts are far more important than fiction, and we hope we have helped in that regard today. But most of all, thank you all for being with us. And if you want to be a part of the coalition, you can see the address here, MaineAffordableEnergy.org, just to voice your support or to join. We are more than welcome. And we thank you for being with us today and look forward to seeing you at the polls on November the 7th. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.